It's the All Things Strange podcast. I am your host, Agent Anderson. Come along as I examine UFO sightings, conspiracies, and all things strange. You can find all of our wonderful links in the description on the Linktree, where you can find our Patreon, our Discord, our merchandise, and more. This week's episode, Danny Casolaro and the Octopus, Part 2. Before we get started, we have two wonderful tiers of Patreon for you. The first tier will get you early access, bonus episodes, and after hours. The second tier will get you the ability to vote on upcoming topics such as this one. And it's a pretty darn good deal. The regular episode I do more or less bi-monthly, but the bonus episodes are pretty much weekly. Lately I've been looking through the recent UFO document releases or tranches or whatever. They just released a fifth one, and there is a lot to get through. So I've been diving through those, looking for exceptional cases to talk about. Well, let's get to Danny Casolaro, Part 2, and the Octopus. Usually I like to provide specific evidence for conspiracies, and if I can't find the evidence, then I'll say so, that it's just speculation or a theory with not really much to back it up. In this case, there is so much going on here, and it's so complex and convoluted that I can't necessarily point out every single last piece of documentation, but a lot of this stuff does appear to be backed up by fact or by something that has been proven through maybe a witness saying something that's later on backed up by documented evidence, or somebody finding a piece of evidence that proves what happened. So instead, this time around, I'm going to go over a whole bunch of stuff and not really get into too much detail because there's just too much of it, and I want to move on to a different topic next time. Because this topic, I mean, the octopus, you could do a couple hundred episodes on this. It could be its own podcast easily. All right, let's get to it. What is the octopus? I'm not sure how well I defined it last time, so let's give it another go. The octopus is a wide-spanning conspiracy involving the CIA, international arms dealers, organized crime, government officials, employees, and politicians, arms smuggling, fraud, bank manipulation, drug trafficking, and political assassinations. It's... Did I say some of those twice? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It's so wide-spanning that it's honestly shocking how far it reaches. It's global. Exactly which conspiracies were involved. The case is so convoluted that there isn't really a clear answer, but I'll do my best to cover the main topics. The main question that occurred to me: who or what are the tentacles of the octopus? The story goes that Danny Casolaro named it that in part because there were supposedly 8 different main branches of the theory. Well, I don't know which branches those would be. There are more than 8, but there are some major players. So let's start getting through stuff in no particular order. If I covered it last time in greater detail, this time around I'll probably just mention it for the sake of being complete. So here we go. In no particular order, the involved conspiracies or people or organizations that were up to shenanigans and involved in Danny Casolaro's octopus are President Reagan and his administration, and Earl Bryan in particular from his administration, specifically involving the October surprise, which still blows my mind that a presidential candidate would pay money for for Americans to be held captive longer. It's just completely bananas. And the National Security Council is the second one. I mean, the Iran Contra affair is the second one under President Reagan. There's probably more, but those are like the two major things. The Iran Contra affair is something that I actually have on my list. It's a whole separate conspiracy of its own. Another entity involved in this case was the National Security Council. For those of you unfamiliar, I've got a quick little definition here of what they do, and it is quite surprising that something like this would be involved. The United States Security Council, NSC, is the national security council used by the President of the United States for consideration of national security, military, and foreign policy matters. Based in the White House, it is part of the Executive Office of the President of the United States and composed of senior national security advisors and presidential cabinet officials. Since its inception in 1947 by President Harry S. Truman, the function of the council has been to advise and assist the president on national security and foreign policies. It also serves as the president's principal arm for coordinating these policies among various government agencies. The council has subsequently played a key role in most major events in U.S. foreign policy, from the Korean War to the War on Terror. In other words, this goes all the way to the top. If the NSC is doing something, there's a good chance that the president knew about it, and there's an even better chance that the president was somehow involved on some level, possibly even dictating policy or giving orders on what to do. Now I never found proof of that, but because of what the NSC is and what they do, I think it's probably safe to make that assumption that this goes all the way to the top. And there are some quotations that suggest that I probably read last time and I might get to this time. We'll see. Another individual involved here is Robert Booth Nichols. This was an important person in this conspiracy. He worked with international cartels to launder and move money around. He had a $3.5 million mansion in Italy, which is equivalent to $14 million, give or take, these days. He also has had residences in France, England, Australia, and the USA. So this guy had tons of money. He warned Danny over the phone to drop the investigation, and he even flew to talk to Danny in person to try and get him to drop it. He was in contact with Danny up until 3 days before Danny's death. So he may or may not have been involved with the decision-making there. He had a lot to hide. Meridian International Logistics was a holding company that handled NSC activities, and its purpose was to funnel money to its directors. So remember I said the NSC, man, that goes all the way to the top, and they're involved in this money laundering. Nichols was wiretapped talking to the president of MCA Music Corporation of America, or MCA is the abbreviation, that's the Music Corporation of America, Eugene Gianquinto, Gianquinto. He was wiretapped talking to him about some illegal stuff. Today, MCA is NBC Universal and part of Universal Music Group. MCA Records, or MCA, was one of the biggest companies in its day. And here's a quotation for you. In 1939, based on Wasserman's recommendation, MCA headquarters moved from Chicago to Beverly Hills, California, creating a movie division. The company began to acquire talent agencies representing established actors such as James Stewart, Henry Fonda, Betty Davis, Jane Wyman, and Ronald Reagan, whom Wasserman became very close with personally. And Wasserman is an individual, I don't get into it in this episode because it's probably not related, but there's a lot on that guy involving organized crime and that kind of stuff. And the fact that he was buddy-buddy with Ronald Reagan, I think, says a lot. In later decades, Wasserman became a guiding force in Reagan's political ambition by helping Reagan to win the presidency of the Screen Actors Guild, then election as governor of California in 1966, and finally president of the United States in 1980. So this guy with proven mob connections is best buds with Reagan and even helped him get elected. And of course, Reagan would have owed him some favors. Some of those names may be unfamiliar to you as they are before my time even, but those are some pretty big names just as an example of who MCA worked with. By the end of the 1930s, MCA had become the largest talent agency in the world with over 700 clients, including movie stars, recording artists, Broadway actors, radio stars, and directors. The company's aggressive acquisition of clientele in all entertainment sectors earned MCA the nickname of the Octopus. Yeah, there was an octopus before Danny Casolaro's Octopus, and it was MCA Records. This case is just so crazy. If you try to explain it to somebody, they would just completely dismiss it because they're like, nah, you sound like you're nuts, buddy. You need to go to an institution and get some help or something. The company's activities led U.S. Department of Justice agents to investigate not only whether MCA was a monopoly breaking antitrust laws, but also its suspected connections to underworld criminal activities. This investigation continued for the next few decades. MCA, this is a whole episode in and of itself easily, but just to kind of summarize, MCA was infiltrated and controlled by organized crime, and the MCA board of directors included former Senator Howard Baker, Les Wasserman, and others. So we have a senator involved with this and also definitely involved in organized crime. And it sort of makes me wonder, a lot of presidents in the United States seem like they're not really all that in control of what's happening. They're just figureheads who have been placed there by other people of influence to do their bidding. So it kind of makes you wonder, was Ronald Reagan one of those cases where he didn't really call the shots? He was just a figurehead, a public face for something else. And in this case, it would be organized crime. So we have, it may be a little tenuous, but we do have a link to organized crime controlling the United States government, at least in some capacity. It's just really wild. The Los Angeles FBI was investigating MCA, and around that time, Wasserman was trying to sell the company to a Japanese company. There were wiretaps, and those wiretaps were sealed by the Department of Justice. No charges were ever made, and the Los Angeles Organized Crime Strike Force was disbanded. The deal went through with the Japanese company, and it was the largest corporate sale in history, at least to that day. I didn't bother looking up if that record still stands. It doesn't really matter all that much. But the DOJ sealed all files on the investigation into MCA and organized crime. That is pretty strong circumstantial evidence that MCA or organized crime had people placed very high in the government to prevent things from happening to them. This is, like I said, it just boggles the mind that our government has been completely infiltrated by organized crime. And if the Department of Justice, who is supposed to be going after these people, instead is covering up for them, what hope do we have, right? It's like we have two separate legal systems, you know? We have a legal system for the average person who can't really afford a lawyer. And if you're even accused of something, whether or not you did it, you might end up being in a lot of trouble. Versus the elite who can do whatever they want, actually control the system. They can commit any crime imaginable, and there are some cases that immediately come to mind, but they can commit any crime they like, and not only is it ignored, it's actively covered up by the government departments that's supposed to be investigating them. All right, the first Intercontinental Development Corporation was a shell corporation formed for the transfer of a prisoner. All of the people listed for the corporation were NSC agents. And here's a little blurb from Wikipedia. First Intercontinental Development Corporation filed as an Articles of Incorporation in the state of California and is no longer active. The corporate entity was filed approximately 48 years ago on Tuesday, August 22nd, 1978, according to public records filed with the California Secretary of State. Oh wait, this wasn't Wikipedia, this was a different website. I forget which one. I should have notated that. Anyways, the president was George K. Pender, who was in the CIA and has Bush family connections. Pender was part of a group that founded General Electric's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Lockland, Ohio in 1947. This, like I said, this just touches on so much. You could spend a whole episode just investigating George K. Pender, the first Intercontinental Development Corporation, how they were involved with the NSC, which NSC agents were involved, and what they got up to. How were they involved with the Bush family? Just this little bit that takes up almost no space in my notes whatsoever could easily be an episode, if not more. This is what I mean. This case is just, it's too much. It's when taking notes for this case, I just sort of felt overwhelmed, and I just didn't know where to even begin or start or continue to. Like, where do you even go next? What do you even cover? There's just so much here. Next up, we've got Clint Murchison Jr. from the Dallas oil family. His dad helped to fund General Douglas MacArthur's presidential campaign. His father was also an associate of Senator Joseph McCarthy, Richard Nixon, and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Robert Mayhew, the former CEO for Howard Hughes operations in Las Vegas, was also involved with this effort. This is all the first Intercontinental Development Corporation here. So we even have somebody with ties to Howard Hughes. This goes back decades in time, involves every branch of everything and every major anything you can think of. It's wild. Okay, another major player was the Cali Cartel, a Colombian drug cartel. They were involved, of course, with selling and distributing drugs, but also with money laundering. Mike Abel was their major money launderer, from what I can find, and they also were involved with arms dealing and smuggling. Another major player in the Octopus conspiracy was Wackenhut, and we'll get to more on them later, hopefully. They worked out of the Cabazon Reservation, and they were involved with the Cabazon Reservation murders. They were involved in assassination, arms smuggling, covert, and probably illegal weapons development with an asterisk, and they were involved with the Iran-Contra scandal. And I say with an asterisk because they did some of this on the Cabazon Reservation, among other places, and that place is technically not the United States, and technically it may have been legal, but it's an asterisk. Meridian International Logistics was their subsidiary, and their subsidiary Meridian Arms were on the reservation also doing things. That's just another kind of shell company that was worked through. The CIA was involved in this. Nichols, mentioned earlier, also worked with and for the CIA. He worked in more than 30 countries, and he was quoted by another witness to say he moved money. Well, he didn't say this, but another witness said that he moved money for anyone that was willing to pay for his services. I'm paraphrasing there, but basically he had no loyalties whatsoever. He was just a money laundering that would launder money for anybody willing to pay him to do so. All right, another branch of this case that I covered last time is the Promise/Inslaw case. Michael Riconosciuto was a major witness. Bill Hamilton was a major player in that. He was the owner of Inslaw. And there were many governments involved in this as well, as I covered last time. In addition to being a spy tool, Promise was really good at laundering money, apparently, through the banking systems after the software had some modifications to it. So that's apparently a big reason why they wanted the software so much, because it was really easy to launder money using the software. As mentioned, Michael Riconosciuto, Riconoscuito, I believe. He was a genius, or he still is, I think he's still around, a genius, a software developer. He worked with Nichols, and he worked for Wackenhut on the Cabazon Reservation. He was busted on drug charges 7 days after providing an affidavit about modifications made to the Promise software. And you might ask, why would Michael come forward at all? What did he possibly have to gain? It appears that he was trying to get into the witness protection program, and that could explain why he was willing to take the risk of testifying or providing an affidavit for that case. I'm guessing he wanted in some way to retire. There are all sorts of wild things that he's supposedly implicated or involved in, including murder, all the other stuff involved here, the Promise software scandal. And at some point, he probably made enough money and he wanted to just retire and get out of it and stop taking all these risks. This is pure speculation on my part. But when you're involved in this, I think that the movies and TV shows are somewhat correct. I don't think you can really retire from this kind of a thing. If you retire, you become a liability. So if you retire, there's a good chance you might be murdered. So he was probably trying to go into witness protection so that he could retire relatively safely. Here's a quote about Bob Nichols. Bob Nichols runs Glenn Shockley. Glenn Shockley runs Jose Londano. And the bottom line here is Bob Nichols and Gilbert Rodriguez and Michael Abel, who's now an attorney in D.C., but he was with the criminal section of the Justice Department, are all in bed together. So these people are all working together, some of them having high positions in the Department of Justice. Michael was handling various things like gold transfers, money laundering, virtual dead drops, like money transfers through the banking system for the Cali cartel and other entities. He told Danny about Mike Abel's work with the Cali cartel, Danny Casolaro, that is. Danny investigated, and within 5 days of starting to investigate Mike Abel and his work with the Cali cartel, within 5 days of that, Danny was dead. Now, on the surface, it might be speculative. You might think it is still possible that Casolaro committed suicide, but on the other hand, the more you read into this, the more implausible that starts to seem. All of these incredibly wealthy and powerful individuals, Danny was trying to expose them. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to expose all of this. Of course he ended up dead. Of course he did. And another thing, just a random notation about Michael Rosencuto, he was working on a railgun for Wackenhut at the Cabazon Reservation. So there's so much random stuff here, it's hard to even organize it. All right, another potential tentacle of the octopus is La Cosa Nostra, or the Italian Mafia, specifically the Gambino and Bufalino crime families. Again, we could do multiple episodes just on that, on those guys. Easily, you could do a couple dozen episodes on those crime families. And another major entity involved was U.S. Customs. And these guys have been in the news a little bit lately. So here's who they are and what they do for those of you unfamiliar. United States Customs and Border Protection, CBP, is the largest federal law enforcement agency of the United States Department of Homeland Security. It is the country's primary border control organization, charged with regulating and facilitating international trade, collecting import duties, as well as enforcing U.S. regulations, including trade, customs, and immigration. The CBP is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the United States. It has a workforce of more than 45,600 federal agents and officers. It is headquartered in Washington, D.C. I know, right? What? So they were involved in this? I guess it makes sense if you wanted to do smuggling, arms deals, drugs, money laundering, all this stuff. You would definitely want to infiltrate these people. And I'm imagining, let's say if you wanted to smuggle a large shipment of drugs or weapons or whatever across the border, it would be pretty easy to do that if you had somebody in power at the CBP. All you would have to do would just be you wouldn't even have to change anything. You could just go in and look at the schedule of when they were going to be patrolling where and just slip in between those patrols. And if you were smart about it, you would send in some expendable people kind of to get caught smuggling a lesser amount on purpose, but make it big enough to be believable. They bust somebody smuggling in $10 million worth of drugs, and they think they've got a sizable bust on their hands. Meanwhile, they're getting billions in through other means or other routes that are not being protected at the moment. I mean, there's other ways this could be implicated. And of course, like I say, you could do multiple episodes on this, but just imagine the possibilities of having the Customs and Border Protection infiltrated or susceptible to manipulation by these people. Scott Lawrence was a U.S. Customs Internal Affairs investigator. He was investigating Peter Videnieks, 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 whatever, I don't know how you say that, a U.S. Customs contract specialist. He also investigated corruption in the department involving the drug trade. The investigation was shut down immediately when he tried to depose officials from the CIA. Despite evidence, no one was ever charged. Again, we see the same pattern popping up when somebody is doing their job and in trying to investigate crime. When they get too close to the truth, they simply get shut down from higher on up. Really chilling stuff. All right, next up in our another tentacle of our many, we've got more than 8 tentacles here, but the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice has regularly participated in covering up anything having to do with organized crime. Sealed files on MCA, shut down investigations into Promise and other investigations, including FBI, U.S. Customs Internal Investigation, the LA Organized Crime Strike Force, U.S. Attorney investigations, a judiciary investigation, and even an RCMP investigation. That's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They even put pressure to get one of those shut down. Some of the investigators were even fired from their jobs. Just let that sink in, just how far-reaching this is, that any investigation anywhere that reached towards the wrong direction was shut down, and the people involved doing their jobs were fired in some cases. Again, multiple episodes could be done on that topic. All right, another important individual who I wanted to get to last time, I wanted to get to this time. Last time I said I wanted to find more information on him. That's Joseph Cuellar, Cuellar, Cuellar. Joseph Cuellar. He worked for the DIA through a company run by the DIA, kind of as a private contractor, and he was former U.S. Army. He was described as a full-time covert agent. And the week before Danny died, he met Joseph in a bar. But it turns out that Joseph Cuellar actually contacted Danny. He's the one that approached Danny, not the other way around. Because Danny's such a friendly guy, he was such a friendly guy, if you were in a bar anywhere near him, he would probably strike up a conversation with you at some point. But this guy approached Danny. They talked about Danny's work on the Octopus case, and it turned out that Danny wanted to interview Peter Videnieks. Cuellar said, surprisingly, that he could arrange that meeting. Danny met with Cuellar several times that week, but it's not known whether or not he actually met with Videnieks. So Peter Videnieks, I'm just going to call him Peter. Peter was a Department of Justice officer and a friend and associate of Joseph Cuellar. He was accused by Michael of witness tampering. I mean, this is just one thing that, But anyways, Michael Ricon. Oh man, I can't say names today, I guess. We'll just call him Michael, the Michael guy. He said that Videnieks attempted during this telephone conversation to persuade me not to cooperate with an independent investigation of the government's piracy of Inslaw's proprietary PROMIS software being conducted by the Committee on the Judiciary of the U.S. House of Representatives. He offered Michael a reward. He would ensure a favorable decision in a custody dispute between his wife and her ex-husband. On the other hand, he threatened Michael with punishment, criminal prosecution for Michael and his father involving a former business associate, and the prosecution was going to be in perjury as well. Peter warned me that credible witnesses would come forward to contradict any damaging claims that I made in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, and that I would subsequently be prosecuted for perjury by the U.S. Department of Justice for my testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. Peter's wife was the assistant to Senator Robert Byrd. Byrd was a West Virginia Democrat, the longest-serving senator ever, and that's a record that still stands today, and a very powerful politician. He also had connections to the CIA. So, this is just like the tentacles just spread throughout everything. The morning of the day that Danny was found dead, a witness saw somebody matching Joseph's description coming out of his room. There isn't really a whole lot else available on Joseph, as you would expect from a career spook, I guess they call them, or a career operative. And that's all I could really find on Joseph Cuellar. He approached Danny. He offered Danny the opportunity to interview Peter. And the stuff I mentioned with Michael and Peter was just a little blurb to sort of flesh out who Peter was. And Peter's wife was an assistant to a powerful politician. And that's it. And then the morning he was dead, a witness saw somebody matching Joseph's description, coming out of Danny's room. And that fact, as I covered last time, that fact was covered up by the police with their public comments. They never mentioned that. It was in their report. We have witnesses, but that was never mentioned publicly because that very much undermines the theory of suicide. Another tentacle of the Octopus was the Defense Intelligence Agency. Man, at this point, I should just go through a list of every government agency and just say that they were involved, because they probably were in some way. Anyways, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, I mentioned them a little bit earlier, is an intelligence agency and combat support agency of the United States Department of Defense specializing in military intelligence. A component of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, DIA informs national, civilian, and defense policymakers about the military intentions and capabilities of foreign governments and non-state actors. It also provides intelligence assistance, integration, and coordination across uniformed military service intelligence components, which remain structurally separate from the DIA. The agency's role encompasses the collection and analysis of military-related foreign, political, economic, industrial, geographic, and medical and health intelligence. DIA produces approximately 1/4 of all intelligence content that goes into the president's daily brief. Yeah. I mean, though that is not an agency that you want compromised by the mob. Another government agency that was involved was the DoD, the Department of Defense. What's the Department of Defense, you say? Well, it's also referred to as the Department of War. They show up once in a while in the news, right? It's an executive department of the United States federal government charged with coordinating and supervising the United States Armed Forces, the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Space Force, and, for some purposes, the Coast Guard, and related functions and agencies. Headquartered at the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., the stated mission of the Department of Defense is, quote, to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security. The Department of Defense is headed by the Secretary of Defense, a cabinet-level official who reports directly to the President of the United States. The President is Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Within the Department of Defense are 3 subordinate military departments: the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force. In addition, 4 national intelligence services are part of the Department of Defense: the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, NSA, and National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and National Reconnaissance Office. Another group involved was the Japanese Yakuza crime syndicate, and we just don't have time to get into that at all, but they were involved in Danny Casolaro's Octopus. This was not just one Colombian drug cartel or the Italian mafia. This was a wide-ranging global conspiracy. All right, the NSA, they were involved. Of course they were. The NSA, or National Security Agency, been mentioned before on this show a few times, is an intelligence agency of the United States Department of Defense under the authority of the Director of National Intelligence, DNI. Are you getting confused with all of these 3-letter agencies yet? Getting them mixed up yet? Because it's hard to keep them straight. The NSA is responsible for global monitoring, collection, and processing of information and data for intelligence and counterintelligence purposes, specializing in a discipline known as signals intelligence, SIGINT. Oh yeah, we did a 3-parter on that one, right? What was it? The Art of Deception, right? That slideshow from Edward Snowden, from his leak. We did 3 parts on that, going through there and taking a look at it. Wild stuff. The NSA is also tasked with the protection of U.S. communications networks and information systems. The NSA relies on a variety of measures to accomplish its mission, the majority of which are clandestine. In other words, probably the mafia. The NSA, not really, they wouldn't officially do that. The NSA has roughly 32,000 employees. The NSA allegedly makes a profit from its activities, and shell corporations are used to distribute this profit to certain people higher up in the structure or other influential individuals. That's why you'll have a shell company with a lot of people on the board of directors who are from either a 3-letter agency or other important people. They refer to drugs as gold and use it as a currency. Payments are made for drugs with weapons. Drugs are easier to transport than gold or other valuable things. They weigh a lot less, so it's probably a lot easier to ship $10 million in drugs than it is in gold. And supposedly, the only government agency that places a medal on a coffin is the NSA. Remember from last time how at Danny Casolaro's funeral, somebody pulled up wearing a lot of medals, and they placed a medal on Danny's coffin as it was being lowered. What does that mean? Was it somebody from the NSA? It's possible. I tried to verify that fact that they're the only agency that does that. I was unable to verify that, so maybe somebody more knowledgeable could leave a comment or something. Who knows? Leave a comment on the episode, but I could not verify that for sure. All right, that's the major players. Of course, I could go on and on. How long are we here? Yeah, we're at like over 40 minutes just in naming the major players and speaking very, very briefly on who they were and what they did. And I didn't even have time to mention how each one was involved specifically in some of the cases. Wild, wild stuff. All right, next I wanted to go over some notes I took on the Nathan Baca series. I mentioned it last time. A journalist named Nathan Baca did a multi-part series that eventually gets to Danny Casolaro and the Octopus. It sounds like more than it is. At first I was thinking, oh man, like a 30, 40 part series. Well, there goes my week. But what it actually was little blurbs or segments that were aired on a local news station. So we're talking, generally speaking, 3 to 5 minute videos. So it really wasn't that bad to get through. It took a couple hours to take notes on it, but it really wasn't that bad. But this story is wild. It has lots of twists and turns. And I was starting to believe that it never led back to Danny Casolaro, but in an unusual twist, as you would expect for this case, it actually did. Well, let's get started. Part 1, he talks about David McGowan, which was a murder-suicide. Allegedly, he killed himself and his family. He was being pressured by the office to change his findings in an investigation of Desert Hot Springs Police. David McGowan worked for the district attorney's office. And his partner's name was Louis Bolanos. That's part 1. See, these are short little things, right? In part 2, they go over the wrongful termination of David McGowan, and they go over an FBI investigation. And it turns out that Louis Bolanos was cleared of all charges after he was fired, but he was not hired back. So just because he was associated with David McGowan, he was fired. I don't think he was even looking into the same stuff that McGowan was. I didn't see part 3 online. I couldn't find it. Part 4 goes over the FBI investigating the DA's office. The chief DA officer, Rick Nelson, and the DA's office had pressured McGowan to change their findings in a police investigation. Lewis, remember who was McGowan's partner, was asked to read the eulogy at the funeral. And the chief, Rick Nelson, asked to read the eulogy before the funeral to kind of check it to see what Lewis was going to say, because he didn't want him to say certain things publicly. And Chief Hodson, the chief police, had 2 officers ready to pull Lewis away during the eulogy if he said anything that they didn't like. Wow. Talk about corruption, right? All right, part 5 discusses a little bit about Lewis and how he was charged with perjury and domestic violence. They hadn't said previously what he had been charged with, but he was charged with perjury and domestic violence, and that's what they used to discredit him and fire him, even though he was completely cleared of charges. Joe Stewart of the FBI investigated. McGowan was investigating officers Norman Lindstrom, Jim Steimer, Larry Essex, David Gallardo, who allegedly filed a false police report. And it was alleged that Clay Hodson, the chief investigator, tried to intimidate McGowan to change his investigation. The next part goes over some more FBI investigation stuff, and the FBI said that the investigation into Lewis was lacking and one-sided, and they were shocked at the lack of professionalism involved in this whole thing involving McGowan and his partner. The DA's office changed their story a little bit over time as to what they said publicly what happened. Desert Hot Springs Police Department officer Roy Hill, here's a quote from him: "I received extreme pressure from the city manager, Jerry Hansen, that I had to make a decision in regards to either to take some kind of action or bring them back to work. And that's regarding the accused officers. They were so he was intimidated to fire the officers. The reason being that they were under investigation, but they had not yet been proved of any wrongdoing, so they were still receiving a paycheck. And the city of Desert Hot Springs was going through a financial problem at the time, and they were on the brink of insolvency. David McGowan died days before he was supposed to testify, and Lewis was targeted because he knew too much about his partner's investigation. So they got rid of him just in case. So that appears to be the motive, and it looks like McGowan was investigating this, and I'm guessing he wasn't finding enough evidence to convict the police officers, and that's why he was pressured to change his mind and, you got to convict these guys so we can fire them. Part 7 talks about McGowan and how he killed his wife, mother, 3 kids, and called 911 and shot himself on the phone. Apparently, McGowan was really angry and said that what they asked him to do was unethical and just plain wrong. They did play the 911 call on the TV news program, and you can hear the phone dialing or whatever. You can hear the phone call, but the person doesn't really say anything. You kind of hear something, some noise of some kind, but you don't hear a voice, and then you hear a gunshot. That, to me, is extremely suspicious. Why would you call 911 and then shoot yourself on the phone? It doesn't really make any sense. It's starting to look a little bit like this might be a hit rather than a suicide. The next part we're getting into is part 9. One of the officers investigated was David Gallardo for Desert Hot Springs Police, and this is part of the FBI investigation as well. The FBI widened their investigation to include the city itself, so beyond just the police department or what they were investigating before. David was fired after allegedly filing a false police report after an officer-involved crash, and he was fired as part of a conspiracy. Apparently McGowan, during this one, it's revealed that McGowan didn't leave a suicide note, and he didn't have any personal problems, including financial problems, according to the DA's office. However, McGowan cleared out his office a week before his death, and there was allegedly a 3-page suicide note. So we have a little bit of a discrepancy there. The DA's office said it was fine, nobody was upset, and there was no suicide note, whereas there were rumors of a suicide note that had been found somewhere. And there were rumors that he had cleaned out his office before his death, indicating that there were actually internal problems. In this part, Nathan Baca tried to get pictures of the workplace to see whether or not it had been cleared out, but he was given the runaround and denied access to that space. But eventually he did get pictures of the workplace, and they showed that the workplace was indeed cleared out, proving that the DA's office was lying about that. And all of these parts, as they aired, were airing as the story unfolded. This was not an investigation to something that had happened previously. So if you watch through all of these, it's kind of cool because you're watching it unfold in real time. I mean, in the past for us, but it wasn't for them. It was live news coverage, more or less. All right, the next part talks about alleged sex crimes. One officer taped another officer and while he was in the process of assaulting a 14-year-old girl, and the officer was never punished. Officer Gill says that a girl told him Officer Jacques Million was grooming her. Jacquesmillion. Officer Gill set up a hidden camera in a hotel room, and the camera caught Jacques kissing the girl. And they didn't really show, they might have showed like a clip of it, but they didn't really say what had happened exactly. But he had done inappropriate things with the girl in the hotel room, and it wasn't specified, but I'm guessing that they put a stop to it before anything more serious could happen. Jacques was offered a deal to quietly resign from the police force in exchange for testifying against the 4 officers that were fired. So we have this really wild conspiracy going on here where we have somebody who's, literally a pedophile getting off scot-free. This is crazy stuff, right? The officer Jacques was implicated in 2 other incidents as well. Police Chief Roy Hill, or former police chief at this point, said that he was disappointed the DA's office hadn't charged Jacques. In addition, Jacques was giving out police secrets to the girl, endangering officers. We're going to do this operation next week. This is going to happen. They're going to do whatever. So if you had that information, then you could definitely prevent those operations from happening. They weren't super specific on exactly what, but apparently he was doing it in sort of a way that was like bragging, kind of weird. McGowan was supposed to testify in this case just days after he died, so he was unable to do so because he was dead. And there was another officer in addition to Jacques who was also accused of sex crimes but was never charged. All right, we are already up to part 15, which revealed that the FBI investigated the murder-suicide and that there were discrepancies between what emergency workers found and what the DA's office said publicly. See, these are quick little blurbs, some of them. Part 16. Sorry, I'm missing some parts here because they were not available online, and I also forgot to say a couple of them too. Officer Marco Anthony Zazueta was working with the Sinaloa Cowboys, which is a Mexican drug cartel. Drugs went missing from the police custody, and people were missing as well, believed to have been given to the cartel. Human trafficking kind of a deal. And there were also dogs that had gone missing from local animal shelters. It turns out, this is a horrible detail, but it turns out that the dogs were given meth and forced to fight to the death in an underground dogfighting/gambling ring. Zazueta worked at the animal shelter in 2002 when the dogs went missing, and some of them were found beaten to death. So it appears that he enjoyed torturing and beating these animals and killing them, in addition to taking them and taking them and giving them to other people to have them fight to death. And he was selling the dogs to the cartel. Zazueta also transferred later after this. He transferred to work at the front desk of the police station, where he had access to police materials and files. So he had access to drugs, private information, evidence, whatever. And some of that stuff did go missing. Officer Matt Denny may have also been involved. The chief of police at the time, Roy Hill, allegedly knew about the situation and did nothing. Although that's just an accusation, it's possible that he didn't know what was going on, or at least not the full extent of it. But Roy did try to get Zazueta terminated. Joe Guzetta, the city manager, refused to terminate him. So it appears that at the city level, there were people involved working with the mafia. Part 19 discusses Officer Matt Denny, who retired in 2004. He was stealing confiscated drugs, and he also had sex with teenage girls aged 13 and 17, and also with a prostitute. So it appears that a large part of this police force was corrupt, or at least part of it was. Who knows how many people were involved. So what they would do is when they confiscated something as evidence, they wouldn't necessarily book the evidence in the records so that they could later steal it and resell it. Crazy, right? Police Chief Patrick Williams of DHS hired Gailey Associates, of private investigators, to investigate the police department, and they found, among other things, that internal investigation documents had gone missing. All right, we're up to part 22 now. This one centered on the dogfighting. Apparently, the dogfighting criminals had protection from the police. Here's a quote. He told me that a lot of drugs he and others that had that night were from former busts in DHS. He laughed at my expression and said that the big guys in the PD there always got their cut. The good drugs in the city busts never really got to the evidence room. And that was an informant that said that, anonymous informant. It was also found that Officer Matt Denny had an untraceable gun for at least 3 years, and the only reason you would want that would be to use it in crimes. Murders, basically. So who knows if he actually murdered anybody. They didn't say that, but that's why you would want something like that. And he was never charged. He was allowed to retire instead of being charged. It's revealed in part 25 that McGowan had been working on the case for the previous 6 months, and he told his wife, or his wife told her sister before the death, that the case would blow her away. And it turns out that McGowan was the one who apparently contacted the FBI. Probably he was having trouble prosecuting this stuff and he wanted help from higher up. Part 26 talks about crime scene photos. There were apparently bloody tracks all over McGowan's house, and it's unlikely that McGowan would have made all of those tracks himself. And it said that the crime scene photos didn't really match the official explanation of what had happened. So we're getting a little bit more trickle of evidence here that this may have been a hit rather than a murder-suicide. Part 27 talks about neighbors that saw a suspicious van speeding away around the time of the deaths. Fast forward to part 30, there was a triple murder in 1981 at the Cabazon Reservation. July 1st, 1981, Fred Alvarez, Patty Castro, Fred Ralph Browser were shot to death on Bob Hope Drive in Rancho Mirage. No one was ever arrested for the shooting. Fred Alvarez was a tribal vice chairman and was planning to blow the whistle on Wackenhut, the private defense contractor mentioned earlier. And they were involved with the casino there and Cabazon Arms. Wackenhut was apparently developing various types of weapons, including biological weapons, on the tribal land. And as mentioned earlier, reservations in the United States are kind of unusual. They're considered sovereign land. They're basically tiny separate nations scattered around the United States. There are even some near where I live. Generally, there is no border checkpoint or any indication whatsoever that you are on tribal land. You could easily accidentally drive onto tribal land without even knowing it. I've never had a run-in myself, but I've talked to people who have, and apparently if you go to an area where outsiders aren't welcomed, the local tribal law enforcement will politely ask you to leave. I've never heard of a case where people were mistreated or abused by the tribes, so they do in some cases enforce their sovereignty, but it appears that they do so as peacefully as possible. Of course, if you're there causing trouble, I'm sure you'll be arrested. One interesting result of these reservations is that in California, casinos are not allowed, but they are allowed on tribal lands because those technically are not part of California. In fact, there's one pretty close to where I live, the Grayton Casino. It's right off the freeway. You just drive off the freeway and it's right there. it does not feel like you're in a different sovereign nation. The borders are largely invisible. Some of the weapons that were developed and built on the Cabazon land were those involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. And we don't want to get into that, a can of worms in this episode. David McGowan was also investigating the Alvarez case. So now it starts to get a little more interesting, and it gets tied into what Danny Casolaro was looking into. This is one of the cases Casolaro was investigating as part of his Octopus conspiracy. At one point, a weapons test was held on the reservation, Cabazon Reservation, with 2 Nicaraguan generals present. It's not exactly what was going on in secret there. It's not exactly clear what was going on there, but it was definitely tied to the Iran-Contra scandal. And just an interesting note, Part 30 is the first time where I noticed Nathan Baca, remember he's the journalist putting this together, this is the first time he refers to McGowan's death as a death, not a suicide, so he's becoming a little suspicious as well. I mean, it's pretty obvious that there might have been something else going on there. An investigator said that they don't want to work on the Alvarez case because of the number of people associated with the case who have wound up dead. It didn't state in the report who these people were, but that gives you an idea of what was going on at the time and that people didn't even want to be involved. You want to do the right thing, but you don't want to put yourself or your family at risk to do so, right? So it might be wiser to just say, all right, maybe I won't touch this particular one. So you still with me here? Did you see all this coming? Did you see McGowan's death being tied into the Octopus? Because up to this point, I was watching all these and I was starting to think, all right, maybe this has nothing to do with that Danny Casolaro. But it turns out, all this started with McGowan's death, and it is directly related to the Octopus conspiracy. Really wild stuff. I mean, there's so much that connects here that at first glance may not seem to. Part 31 of the series starts to talk about Inslaw and Promise and Michael Riconosciuto modifying that software at a Wackenhut location on the Cabazon Reservation. I found, kind of randomly, just as an aside, a completely surprising connection. Pergamon Press, a Soviet-friendly firm, published numerous Soviet science books in the West. A bugged version of the case management software Promise was allegedly sold in the 1980s for Soviet government use, with Maxwell as a conduit. And this quote is talking about Robert Maxwell, by the way, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. That's right, this case even has ties to Epstein stuff. Mind blown. That's why it was completely surprising, is that like I said, this case is so wild. You just tell somebody, oh yeah, this Danny Casolaro dude, he was investigating this money laundering stuff and these murders, and it even has ties to President Reagan and Epstein. Nobody would believe you if you told them that in a bar. You just met somebody and tried telling them about this case. It's just too wild. This is too wild. And here's another blurb I found. Distribution of Promise software to facilitate Israeli spying. Maxwell is alleged to have distributed a bugged version of software, Promise, to a plethora of national governments and global financial institutions that enabled mass spying by the government of Israel. Maxwell was allegedly able to sell the bugged Israeli version of the Promise software to Sandia National Laboratories and Los Alamos National Laboratory, two of the most important nuclear research and national security facilities in the United States. Maxwell allegedly employed John Tower, chairman of the United States Senate Committee on Armed Services, to facilitate the sales of the bugged Israeli version of the Promise software to Sandia and Los Alamos. Okay, we'll leave that can of worms alone for now, but Papa Max worked for Israeli intelligence, and they were able to distribute the spyware that came from the United States to some of the most classified bases in the United States. It came full circle. It's just too crazy. Every time I get a handle on this case, it just gets wilder. I don't know. It's too crazy, man. Too crazy. All right, let's move on. Part 32. The DA would not confirm whether or not McGowan was looking into the Cabazon murders, but friends suspect that he was. And the Cabazon murders happened execution style inside of a home. I was hoping to cover the Cabazon murders in a little bit more detail, but there's really just too much stuff to get to here. It, ties into too many different things. Ralph Boger was one of the people murdered alongside of Alvarez. His daughter Rachel started going on a crusade to try to solve what had happened to her father. And when she started looking into the murder, a week after she started that, she began receiving death threats. So these are some pretty serious pretty serious events here, right? It ties into a much larger crime cartel that don't like being investigated. Part 36 starts talking about Robert Booth Nichols. We talked about him earlier. He was CIA. He was involved in money laundering, gun running. He had a small role in the movie Under Siege, a Steven Seagal movie. I don't know if you guys remember that movie or not, but he was in the movie. He was involved in weapon deals at the Cabazon Reservation, and his business partner, Sam Israel, tried to fake his own death but was later caught. It's believed that Nichols may have faked his own death successfully, and Nichols may be connected to the Alvarez murders. Skipping ahead to parts 38 and 39, Jimmy Hughes was arrested for the 1981 murders. He worked as a security chief for the Cabazon tribe, and he accepted a contract for the kill. He admitted to have killed at least 6 people as a contract killer. Rachel Boger confronted him and secretly recorded their conversation, and he basically admits it. Quote, "I killed people all over the world, right or wrong, because the government ordered me to." Yeah. I mean, who would have thought that a small town district attorney guy named McGowan getting murdered would lead us all the way back to the Octopus conspiracy? It's just wild stuff. Another quote, "Your dad and I were friends. He touched somebody. They gave an order, and that was what happened to him. It's a lot bigger than the murder of this guy or the murder of that guy. You're talking political people." So like he won't even say, but as we established earlier, it looks like this goes all the way up to the presidency. Okay, that's a brief version of that series and how it went down. I think it's entirely possible that McGowan was a hit, that it was not a suicide, especially the way they covered up the suicide note and the way that the phone call was made. Was there a suicide note? Was there not? I never saw that there was. Maybe it was just a rumor. Maybe it was a note that wasn't really a suicide note, but they said it was. Who knows? But if it really was a genuine suicide note and this is an open and shut case, why would they lie about it? Why would they cover up evidence publicly? And why would people not be prosecuted or investigated? The whole thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense. All right, next I'm going to do, in no particular order, some murders associated with the Octopus. Mariposa County Sheriff's Officer Ron Van Meter died in a boating accident after uncovering drug trafficking within the sheriff's department. Doug Johnson, who worked at a computer graphics company, was found shot in his car in the company parking lot. He was shot behind his left ear from at least 12 inches away. He was right-handed, and of course his left side would be towards the door if he was in the driver's seat. I know some countries they drive on the right side of the car, but in the United States we do it on the left side. So if somebody walked up to his car and shot him, that would be where they shot him. No gun was found at the scene, and there was no gunpowder residue on his hands, but for some strange reason it was never ruled a homicide or a suicide. His family and friends, and I would take it one step further and say anybody with a working brain, his family and friends do not believe he would have committed suicide because he had just finished school and started a new job. He was also close to his friends and family, and they saw no signs of depression or suicidal thoughts. And if it was more than 12 inches away and there was no gun found, it couldn't have been suicide. It was clearly a murder, but it was not ruled a murder. As we've seen so many times in this case, it appears that it was covered up from higher on up. Doug lived in a similar house and drove a similar car to Don Devereaux. Don lived across the street from the parking lot where Doug was found dead. Don was a journalist looking into the death of Charles Morgan, among others. He was contacted in 1991 by Danny and agreed to share information with Danny about Charles's money laundering activities. Danny died before the information could be mailed. Don believes that Danny was murdered. Don later learned, through another journalist, that there was a hit out on him. It looks like Doug was killed by accident because he had a nearly identical car, and he didn't seem to have any connections whatsoever to the Octopus or anything else that would get him killed. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was never a suspect, and no one was ever charged. It was never even probably investigated. Next up, Charles Morgan. He was a businessman, president of his own escrow agency that he owned. He was a potential witness in a land fraud case involving organized crime. He vanished on March 22, 1977, after dropping his daughters off at school. He returned home 3 days later, missing a shoe, a plastic handcuff on one ankle, and his hands zip-tied together. He was unable to speak, but he wrote with pen and paper that he had been kidnapped and tortured. He apparently was also given a hallucinogenic drug. Who do we know that liked to use hallucinogens on people? Could it be the CIA? Probably not. They wouldn't torture somebody. He would not say who kidnapped him. He asked his wife not to call the police because he feared his family would be killed and that he would be as well. His wife nursed him back to health by feeding him with an eyedropper over the next week, so this guy was in pretty rough shape. And he claimed that he had been working for the government as an agent fighting organized crime. He said that he had escaped his captors near the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, so he escaped. He was probably going to be killed at that time. After this event, he became paranoid, but I mean, is it paranoia if you have something real to fear? But anyways, he started acting paranoid and began wearing a bulletproof vest everywhere. He told his family that if he went missing again, there was a letter for them to find that would explain who was responsible. The letter has never been found. 2 months after his disappearance, he went missing again. 9 days later, a woman called Chuck's wife and said, "Chuck is all right." Ecclesiastes 12:1-8. And that's a Bible passage that reads, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." That's a really strange way to send a message, but it says men are afraid of a high place. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? That suggests that this hit was involved with powers higher on up. You know, this was not some low-level thugs that were doing this. This was probably a government organization, possibly under orders by people close to the president. We don't know. Even though this happened before Reagan was president, we don't know for a fact that previous administrations were not similarly involved with organized crime. Jimmy Carter, say it ain't so. Say it ain't so, Jimmy. He was one of the good ones, right? Right? Anyways, Chuck was found shot to death 2 days later in the desert, 30 feet away from a highway in the San Juan Springs area. He was shot in the back of the head with his own .357 Magnum, which was found beside him on the ground. No fingerprints were recovered from the gun, and there was gun residue on his left hand, suggesting that he had fired a gun. He had a $2 bill clipped to the inside of his underwear. 7 Spanish names were written on the bill. Could this be the letter he told his family about that was going to reveal his captors and killers? Ecclesiastes 12 was also written on the bill, with verses 1 to 8 marked by arrows drawn to the serial number. So he was trying to send a message here. On the back of the bill, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were numbered 1 through 7. A crude map was also drawn showing roads between Tucson and the Mexican border. The towns of Robles Junction and Sasebe were marked. These two towns are known for criminal activity. A note in his handwriting was found in his car with directions to where he was found dead. There were also several weapons and ammo in his car. Also found in his car was a piece of one of his teeth wrapped in a white handkerchief. And there were also sunglasses in his car that did not belong to him. 2 days after his death, an anonymous woman called the Pima County Sheriff's Office. She said she was supposed to meet Chuck at a local motel and that her nickname was Green Eyes. She said she was the same woman that had called Chuck's wife, so maybe he had an informant, somebody who was on his side. She said that they met and Chuck showed her a briefcase of money that he was using to buy himself out of a cartel contract. His death was, of course, ruled a suicide, as you would expect, right? After his death, his impounded car was broken into and his office was ransacked, possibly to destroy or eliminate evidence. 3 weeks after his death, 2 men claiming to be FBI came to his house and told his wife they needed to look for something. They searched the house for quite a while. It is not known if they found what they were looking for or if they were indeed from the FBI. When reporter Don Devereaux contacted the FBI, they denied that their agents had searched the house. It is believed that Chuck didn't work for the government trying to catch criminals, but laundered money using his business for the cartels. Records show that he handled millions of dollars in platinum and gold bullion. There was no physical bullion, it was all paper laundering. It is believed that he met with a hitman to pay off his contract, but the hitman killed him and took the money and probably got paid for the hit as well. You know, why not, right? I mean, this is a hitman we're talking about here. How silly can you get? If I pay you this money, don't kill me. Or how about I kill you, take the money, and get paid for killing you? I mean, you know. Danny wanted information about Chuck's laundering activities, which appear to have been global, not just local crime. Next up, we have Don Bolles, B-O-L-L-E-S, Bolles, who was an investigative reporter. He was investigating real estate fraud, and he died in a car bombing in 1976 in Phoenix, Arizona. This one is only tangentially related, but is mentioned sometimes in connection to the octopus, so that's why I'm putting a little note here. Neil and Brendan Abernathy were shot in the back of the head execution style in their home on February 19, 1997. Brendan was only 12 years old. There is very little information about this murder. Michael R. Ricconsciuto says that Neil, who ran his own auto repair business, had papers given to him by Michael. There is some nebulous connection to Promise, but what exactly isn't clear. Some believe it was drug-related. Some people think it might have just been the wrong house. Paul Maraska. He worked as a casino manager at the Cabazon Reservation. He worked with Michael and described him as his partner. Michael described him as his partner. Whatever, they were partners. He was also involved with organized crime laundering money. Supposedly, he had codes for offshore bank accounts and how to access them, among other things. He was murdered, found on January 14, 1982. He was tortured and hogtied with a telephone cord in such a way that he slowly strangled himself as his legs got more and more tired. Oh, man, brutal. He was found by Michael R. Michael R., who found the body, didn't go to the police. Rather, he drove 500 miles to the Cabazon Reservation and told Nichols of the death. Nichols called his San Francisco lawyer, who then called the police. Nichols claims that it was Michael who tortured and killed Paul, and Michael accused Philip Arthur Thompson of killing Paul. We don't have time to get into it, but again, this is easily a case by itself. Stuff is just all crazy. Mary Quick is a 63-year-old school teacher. She was shot in the face and had her purse stolen outside of the Fresno American Legion Post 509 3 days after Paul was killed. It's believed to have been a random robbery, but it turns out that her nephew, Brian Weiss, who was living with her, was a business associate of Michael, and it's believed that she was suspected of having bank codes and passwords for offshore accounts in her possession. All right, so I'm going to have to end it here. We are a little over an hour 30. I've only scratched the surface of this thing. There are dozens of more people and entities involved. There are more murders. There are more crimes. There's more everything. I couldn't possibly cover it all without a dedicated podcast for the case. There are so many connections all over the world through the decades, touching so many different people and organizations that it becomes a convoluted mess that's really hard to make sense of. I can't even really do a summary, other than to say it's a vast conspiracy of guns, drugs, and illegal money that involves every level of society up to the President of the United States, among other world leaders. Honestly, it's all a bit much to take in. Like I said earlier, if you tried to explain it to a friend, they wouldn't believe you. It seems made up. Maybe that's part of how they keep getting away with stuff like this, is it just sounds too crazy to be true. If you want to take a deep dive yourself, check out The Last Circle by Sherry Seymour, Cheriseymour. I found some of her work about Danny and the Octopus online. There's a draft version online by Carol Marshall, which I assume is a pen name that she used for safety reasons. The book is supposed to be one of the best resources for the case, and the manuscript I read through was certainly very detailed on all this stuff. It's nearly the book version, The Last Circle. It's on Amazon. It's nearly 500 pages, and it covers many, many aspects of the case. Okay, so I don't know. I got mixed feelings about this one. I kind of feel like I didn't really do it justice, but then again, I do want to move on to other topics. I mean, this is a wild one. This is just one of the craziest cases I've ever looked at. And I don't even know where to begin with it, you know? It's like, where do you even start? How do you even begin to cover this case? If I ever come into some money, I'm going to contact Sherry Seymour and see if we can put together a documentary, because the one they did for Netflix, I felt spent too much time on the filmmakers and not enough time on the case. I would like a more fact-driven, chronological kind of a deal that makes connections between different people and organizations, rather than, oh, look, this filmmaker, yeah, he looks a lot like Danny Casolaro and he's looking into it, you know? Isn't that weird? Yeah, it's weird, whatever. Tell me about the case, you know? So anyways, that's kind of a dream bucket list. Maybe if I win the lottery sometime, I can produce that movie. Hey, and if you're listening to this and you want to steal that idea, by all means, feel free to. And if you're a filmmaker, please do not put yourself in the documentary. It's just stupid. We don't want to see you. We want to see the case. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening. And I really appreciate you folks who support me on Patreon. No after hours today. This recording went really long, and I want to get it edited out so I want to get it edited and put out in a reasonable amount of time. So I'm going to skip the after hours this week. Whew, man, this one's wild. Okay, thank you guys. Until next time, keep it strange.